the one I want. Yeah. Cool. I wonder if someone in Victoria can confirm that they can hear me. Great. I don't know if y'all saw the link to the GitHub repo in the Slack channel. I sent a link to this repo here. So in this lecture, we have a bunch of fun examples. They're just plain HTML and CSS, so it's really easy to pop open your DevTools, play around with them, see what stuff does. So I strongly recommend that as we're going through. Um, if you notice something weird as you're playing around with it, please feel free to send over a question. And can I get a volunteer to forward questions from Victoria to me? Yeah. This whole table will band together to do Victoria liaison for me? Great. Oh, my name's Garrett. Thank you for asking, Gabe. Um, good job. Great. So today we're talking about responsive design. Um, is that a term that you've been exposed to yet? Yes? Okay, you've come across the term. It's a thing that comes up. Talk to your doctor about responsive design. Talk to your doctor about responsive design. So what does that sound like, or what does that feel like it means to you? Response? Yeah. The web page responds to the size of the screen it's being viewed from. Right. Certainly a major aspect of responsive design is the viewport size, right? Usually the horizontal viewport size is what we care about. We don't mind much if our web pages scroll vertically forever. In fact, sometimes we design that in on purpose. Um, but we generally don't like them to move horizontally too much. I would argue that responsive design also is about more than that. It's about thinking of the web pages that you build as not just static layouts built rigidly based on this many pixels across and this high and these percentages and 3 columns here and 9 columns here. Responsive design is more about building your web pages in a way that you're programming the layout and you're programming the interface so that at various screen sizes, it doesn't matter what content you throw at it, it doesn't matter what size it is, um, because you think of it in terms of behavior rather than fixed layout, the page knows how to respond in all sorts of circumstances. So in addition to desktop and mobile, which is what we usually think about, another part of responsive design is what does it look like when you print it? So a page that is print responsive will do things like hide images or turn them black and white. It'll hide elements like your dark colored nav bar. It'll make the page width more like the width of a piece of paper. So that's part of responsive design too. Also, when you consider what your web page does with content, if you're building an app that users are allowed to input things into, um, what happens if, yeah? Um, I will have a look, Sammy, but I don't think I don't think I know how to do that. Oh, maybe I can just do this. Oh, I can do that. How does that look? Okay, great. Um, I lost my train of thought. It was responsive, but there was a significant human component that made it not very scalable. Um, so that's one way to make a page responsive is you receive an HTTP request, send the user an email about what size their window is, and then adjust your CSS accordingly so that it fits their thing. Um, right, I was talking about content. Thank you. So if you're dealing with an app that takes in user inputs for text, for images, for parameters that create, if you're using like a resume editor or something, the user might be able to set margins and things. Um, you need to do a lot of thinking around what's going to happen when I get things that are unpredictable. Sometimes your decisions are like, well, it's going to be 140 characters, and we can just handle that. That makes your design a lot easier if you put character limits on things, right? Um, for images, you probably want to program in, okay, this image is going to go inside of this container, and then this container is going to give it instructions about how to behave, how to shape itself. And that way you don't end up with that problem where you drop an image in and it like blows the whole page up, pushes a bunch of things underneath, and just breaks your layout. So we're going to think about that sort of thing as we go through responsive design. So responsive design is it's not one thing. It's not like, oh, do Flexbox and you're doing responsive. Although that's a good start. Um, responsive design is a collection of tools and techniques that make your page adaptable to variable content and variable context. So we're going to look at some examples. I think the first example I'm going to use here is GitHub. I just learned is not very responsive. Um, so if I go to the mobile view, that's Command Alt M on Firefox, and I think it's Command Shift M on Chrome to go into mobile view, or responsive view, I should say. And you see up here, I can set my. Can I make that bigger? Yeah, cool. I can set my my screen size here. I can set the device orientation. So this is in landscape mode now, portrait landscape. And I can choose a number of devices that are pre-programmed in, or just set it to whatever I want. So if I want to see how it looks on an iPad, um, I can do that. I can choose iPad, and that's what my tablet view looks like. So GitHub, it like goes off to the side and scroll horizontally. The font size is the same as desktop, and that's causing problems. Not very responsive. Luckily, the internet is full of other websites, um, many of which are responsive. So I have a few examples here. This one is, I think it's a company I bought my longboard from. Um, so let's notice a few things about this layout. We have this nav bar up top here. We have this shopping cart icon over on the right, a logo and some menu items here, and then like kind of a secondary nav bar above it. A big hero image takes up the whole width of the screen, and then we have some like a horizontal container with some product images, another horizontal container, and then it's just kind of like a standard e-commerce landing page, right? It shows you the thing. This is a good longboard, by the way. Um, so let's see how it behaves when the window gets narrower. Um, as we can see, there's a little bit of behavior implied here in how you notice what happens to the free space in the nav bar. Um, it kind of continues distributing in this way that's like, okay, the things on the left stay all the way to the left, and the things on the right stay all the way to the right. That's not necessarily the only way to do it, as we'll see later when we talk about Flexbox. Um, let's go a little smaller and see what happens. I want to see what happens. Yeah, when we start getting like pretty cramped here, something happens. It switches, right? Um, Now all my menu items are gone. That secondary menu is gone. The logo is tiny now, and we have this hamburger icon here. Oh, that's weird. This page doesn't. Oh, the video ended. That's what happened. So I have this little hamburger icon here, and there are menu items. Okay. Looks like. Let's see. Are those the same things? I think yeah, that's like the main nav bar, and then that's kind of the orange nav bar that was above it. I think. Yeah. Yeah. Um, let's see what happens. Let's continue and look at other parts of the page. So we shrink this. It does kind of this jumpy thing that I'm not crazy about. Um, there, and this is kind of a different window width, right? It decides, okay, it doesn't make sense any longer to have these things positioned in a row of three. So we'll just make this a full width header, and then we'll move those pictures down. And this layout looks okay. I think that's a reasonable concession because when you start getting to, like right here, it looks okay, but you can imagine that if we went a little smaller and a little smaller, um, soon these photos would be nothing much to look at. This text would be squished, and maybe we'd get some weird word breaking. It would be a bad time. So yeah, these images I would argue are maybe a little bit narrow. This text is a little bit squished at the size it's at. Let's see if they do anything for when the window gets a little bit smaller. They do. Okay. So what's going on here? We have these like wide margins on the side here. So that tells me that this box might be set to like a percentage of the viewport or a portion of the viewport. And then when we get smaller, it says, okay, new portion, the viewport's much smaller. You can just expand to fill to fill most of the viewport. But you can imagine when it's much larger, like this proportion just looks right. You get smaller and smaller. Then this starts to get squished. That's not very good. And then snap. They take up, that margin is gone now. And what is, I think this does something interesting too. Yeah, so you have this cool kind of photo column thing going on that when this gets smaller, they just say this, smaller than that. This changes to full width, and these are like centered now, whereas before I think they were still centered, so that doesn't actually change. Never mind. But yeah, that's an example of how this straightforward e-commerce site that you've probably seen 1,000 times has all this behavior implied into how it works. A lot of that is just how HTML works and how the browser works. So when you see text, when you see a box like this, I'm gonna just do this manually actually. So take this H3. Oh, they're styling right on the element. Scary. And watch what happens as I scale the size of this heading. Is as the size changes, the words just know how to wrap, which I don't think anybody is seeing for the first time here. But like that's kind of magic, right? Like somebody had to write code that notices that something is approaching the edge of the amount of space it's allowed to occupy, and it does some math to say like, whoa, the next character is going to be 16 pixels wide, and we only have 14 pixels left in the container. This has to go on the next line. But wait, this is part of a word, so that whole word, we're going to have to figure out where the word starts and then move all of that down. And all this like complex behavior happens. And so responsive design is partly about the stuff that you can figure on your own. Like, okay, we've decided that this image doesn't look good at this size, so we're gonna tip it sideways and make it full width at this screen size. But it's also understanding how the web page, like how the browser has all this built-in behavior for you that's implied and how to override it when you want to. Any questions so far? Mobile view, of course. Yeah. What does it look like in the mobile view? Not that great. I think this looks. I'm gonna try refreshing the page and see if we can give it another shake. I think this maybe looks bad just because the video had ended. It looks a little bit more reasonable. So again, we have this hamburger menu thing that comes out, and this menu takes up like most of the screen, right? Which is which is a big deal. So it kind of signals that the page is still there. It's just kind of hidden, so it doesn't totally take you out of context, but it does give you like lots of screen real estate to focus on just one thing at a time. And this is kind of similar to before, right? I think this is exactly the same as before, when we just made the window like quarter width. I would argue that maybe these images should be stacked because they look a little squished to me. But it looks like a lot of the same decisions at that quarter screen width size persist for the mobile view. Yeah, it's right over there. I wrote it today. Yes, so this board's like pretty cool actually. Just crushes hills. Oh yeah, I noticed that GitHub has this thing where where GitHub pages are not responsive. So I went to do y'all know about GitHub Pages? Okay, so GitHub Pages has this default behavior where if the repo has a README but no index HTML, it just uses the README as the index HTML. So I go to, I don't know if I can zoom in on this gainfully, but my username.github.io/responsive design and Sass, that's the name of the repo. And we get the README here, and this one is responsive. So I had that open. So let's look at another example here. Page not found. It's just supposed to be bbc.com. Wonder what I did wrong. Yeah, probably. I bet that's what's happening. No, I think probably I probably just wrote bbc.com, so it interpreted it as a relative path instead of an absolute path. So this is what the BBC website looks like. And what we notice about this is that it's got these like big chunky images and large, fairly bold headers. It's got a lot of information. And the information hierarchy kind of goes like, in the BBC's opinion today, this is the most important story. And then you have these stories that are kind of similarly important. And then down here you have your different categories. So I think some people are just going to scroll straight down to sports maybe. And then we keep going, and there's more stuff. But let's see what happens when the context of the page changes. And let's pay attention to how bbc.com maintains this information hierarchy. In other words, these decisions about what's important and what order is desired as the page size changes. So far, so good. All we're doing is eating up margin at this point. So what that implies about this site and many sites is that you generally don't want your sites to go past a certain maximum width, right? If they just keep sprawling and sprawling and sprawling forever, they become unreadable. The ideal length for a line of text for reading is said to be about 50 to 70 characters. So you'll notice that most websites kind of cap out around there, kind of around the same size. So when we run out of margin, what's going to happen? That's interesting. Notice how this text gets bolder? The text weight changes? I think it's actually changing the font weight. And the menu changes too. They decide that some of these categories are just going to collapse. They're less important and they're probably hidden under more. And then when we get real small, this gentleman gets very big. And this emphasizes that information hierarchy in a different way. You have your most important story here, then your secondary stories here, and then your categories are as they were below. Get a little smaller. And they maintain that layout. That continues looking good. So you can just keep scaling that layout until it stops looking good. And let's see what it looks like on mobile. That's interesting. So now you have your hero image up here. And in all these other stories, they chose to disappear the images. So it's kind of interesting that you can do that. Um, you can make elements selectively render based on viewport size. It's also interesting that the decision that they made was that at this screen size, you can't really maintain the information hierarchy of this image is the most important and everything else is secondary with an image this size. You can't imagine images on this size of screen that are like half of this size or a third of this size that would still carry meaning. So the decision was made here. I wasn't in that meeting. So the decision appears to have been made here that they'll just hide the images altogether and you just get the headings. And all of this behavior is programmed into this page. So as these decisions were made, and probably made iteratively over many, many rounds of the developers build something, somebody notices, I don't know if that looks so good. Many meetings take place and whiteboarding sessions take place, deciding what to do instead, and they make a new iteration. All of that behavior is baked into the page itself. So these pages are not, yeah, they're not just whipped together. They're also not static. They're not fixed. They're not just you plop these elements in and they just live there statically, like putting up a picket fence. Web pages are dynamic and they grow and shrink, and you pour content into them and they like bulge in certain places and pass everything through in different places. This analogy is getting kind of strained. You want to look at a bad example? Okay. So I don't mean to pick on Peaceful Restaurant, but they're uh, um, so we're not exactly designers here, um, but you don't have to be particularly gifted in aesthetics to notice that this page could maybe use some attention. I do like these though. So oh yikes, we can see even down here we're already kind of exceeding our containers in certain places. And I'll tell you that this site actually does a surprising before we get into this, it does a surprisingly good job, better than I expected, at responding to variable viewport sizes. Um, so let's see what happens. So we get smaller, smaller. We're chewing up the margin like normal, and then we start to scale. Kind of, right? Probably, probably. I also want to give them props for like obviously they didn't just pick a template and build it in Squarespace or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with Squarespace, but this looks like a handcrafted website, which is kind of cool. Um, it's kind of fun that this menu doesn't really wrap exactly. It just kind of floats underneath the banner. That's funny. And this is cool. We do eventually hit a breakpoint. The logo gets super small, and the menu gets hamburgered. Yeah. Um, yeah. So, hamburger, for the sake of Victoria, was the outburst. Um, so this is called a hamburger menu. If y'all didn't know, because it looks like a hamburger, I guess somebody thought. Um, yeah. And so to make a menu into a hamburger menu, I used hamburger as a verb to answer your question. Yeah. So like some of this is just oh, that's strange. You notice how when we go small and a new image comes in, it stays small. So there's was it? Oh, I see. Yeah, it was overflowing, and then the next image was the right size. Yeah. Okay. So that's a lesson. We're not going to dig into exactly why that's happening, but that's a lesson in why you should be careful about styling your page with JavaScript. I bet. And let's see what it looks like on mobile. Huh. It's actually not bad. um, and the text here doesn't overflow the container, right? Remember at full view it does this overflow thing, and that's no good. But the mobile site does okay. So yeah, yeah. Um so yeah, so too much text was the comment. You mean down here? Oh, just in general it's too much text? Yeah, yeah, and it's not necessarily wrong to have this much text on the page, but it's not architected uh in a very atomic way. Yeah, it's not quick to it doesn't read well. It doesn't call attention to anything in particular. Even these headings are like roughly the same size as these links, I guess, which are not that much larger than the body text here, and just nothing really draws your eye and tells you where to look. You really have to stop and scan. So yeah, too much text is a good point. Um, so that's peaceful restaurant. And here's an example of a site that I think has great web design. This is for Guilt and Company. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? It's a bar in Gastown, Vancouver zone, and their website is so cool. So you have this thing where you can follow the cherub, or you can follow the imp, the angel or the devil, and the cherub is blue and good, and they float up here, so you know that you're following the moral path or the immoral path. And the devil is red, and you have booze and skulls and wasps and things, and a pelvis. So there's all this interactivity as I scroll. These barrels go up and down. This skull expands to show me an old timey film. It's really interesting. A lot of work obviously went into this, and I quite like it. Um, Instead of a pelvis, you get a beating heart, which is good, I guess. I don't know. Oh yeah, maybe. Um, so that's just a fun site that I like showing to people. Um, but as we scale, oh dear. So if you imagine you're wandering around Gastown, like where is Guilt and Co? So you go to guiltandcompany.com and you go to their mobile site. Yeah, you're like, what is this? um, and so there's this thing where you scroll to the right, and like all this stuff is gone. So what that tells me is that some parent container, maybe the body element or something, is set to 100% of the viewport width. And all this other content that's trying to push out, like I think maybe this header is pushing outside of there. All of that is being cut off and hidden. Yeah. Yeah, so this is the kind of thing that you want to avoid. I don't blame them for not making a mobile version of this site because this would have taken so long and have so many like absolutely positioned elements that have like set margins and animation loops and things like that. Um, but even interesting layouts can wind up being not mobile responsive at all. It would not have been that hard to have taken this desktop view and when you go to mobile, just change to a completely different layout plan, which I think would have been better than this. So yeah, the discussion for Victoria is that, of course, building a mobile site would have been, more expensive. It could have cost up to twice as much, but they could have made the mobile site simpler. It wouldn't have needed to be so elaborate. You could have done something as simple as take the header items and just arrange them vertically. Just do an alternative graphic to this kind of scroll looking thing, and maybe I guess when you click this, it just scrolls down the page. I don't actually know how. Do I then have to click this? Is that how this works? I've never gotten this far on this site. Yeah, and then that just directs you to like a normal page, and I think this is an image, so that's not responsive either. So that's not a great plan. I understand the temptation to just take an image, like the same image that you sent to the printer for your menus, to just throw that on your site. Um, but somebody made this menu on a computer. So it would have taken more work to make this actually like a web menu, write the markup and style it and everything. So, you know, it, using an image for your menu is lazy, and the downside is that, someone on mobile is going to have to scroll around and kind of look at it through a magnifying glass like this. Um, so I love you, Guilt and Company, but not on my phone. So maybe that gives us a taste a little bit for what mobile responsiveness is about. What are some patterns you noticed across these examples? Nav bars tend to collapse as they run out of space and collapse into somewhere that's hidden that you can then access as like a secondary screen or a modal or something. Yeah, that's a good one. They tend to. Oh, okay. Um, yeah, so I wonder if so the suggestion was that um, they stagger the loading of images. Oh, so if you're in mobile view, oh, maybe they avoid loading the images at all. Um, yeah, it could be. Should speed up page loads. Right. Um, Right. Costs you $400 to open the BBC site. Yeah. Um, right. It's prioritizing. It's that information hierarchy. That wasn't hard the first few times. The information hierarchy is important, and it's expressed in different ways, right? At different sizes, you express the importance of different information units um, in different ways, often using the same markup, sometimes by hiding and displaying disparate elements. Um, Anything else? Anything from Victoria? It's funny. Okay, so who's interested in learning to make sites like this? Good. Good. I'm not gonna call out the hands I didn't see go up, but um, that's good. So I think your plan A should always be to make a layout that's inherently flexible. So as it gets wider or smaller, you saw how the BBC website had kind of a fixed max width. So if the screen gets very, very, very long, like you're on one of those like enormous curved Samsung monitors, you don't have to start reading over here and keep reading until you get to here, and then go back to here. You'd get tired from rotating on your chair all day. They grow to a certain width, and knowing that windows could get wider than that, uh, they know when to stop growing. They know when to stop shrinking and defer to a different plan. And they also know things like how to distribute space between menu items, right? So like if the menu gets wider, it knows to continue pushing the left thing to the left and the right thing to the right. Um, it knows that if you have these elements that are already at their minimum width and the window keeps shrinking, maybe the thing to do is to wrap one of them underneath. So I think that's always a place to start. So as a web developer, particularly a front-end web developer, you'll often get a mock-up that looks like this, where someone has gone into Photoshop with like a ruler and protractor that they hold up against their screen, and they draw out pixel sizes, and they create this in, maybe they send you over like a Photoshop document, and they tell you just do this, and you're like, okay. And so you get to work doing it, and then you have all these lorem ipsum, lorem ipsum, lorem ipsum ad infinitum. Um, and you go, okay, I made this whole thing in HTML. It's exactly pixel perfect to the thing you designed. And then they go, great. Here are the things that the menu actually has to say. And then you go, oh, okay. So that's like 6 things, and you only said you needed 5. And now my whole layout breaks. Oops. Um, and then some of this body text is like this, maybe this center block gets really, really long, right? And so it flows over the boundary of this container. And so you say, okay, I'll just make the container fit so it expands. No one can see what I'm doing in front of my screen, I just realized. Um, so this container will expand to fit all this text content. But now these look kind of naked underneath here, and we don't really like that. So there are all these things um, when you actually release your app out into the wild, or even just onto a staging server, where if you haven't thought about how is this going to respond to a menu item that is 15 characters long, you might run into trouble. If you haven't worked out like what's it going to look like when this line contains a word that's longer than these 2 ipsum words. These are 2 pretty long ipsum words. But what are you going to do? How's that word going to break? How's the column going to change? What if the window's twice as wide or half as wide, right? If you haven't made those considerations, you might be surprised by the way your page displays. You'll be far less surprised if you use Flexbox, however. So that's what I mostly want to talk about today. If you get one thing out of the lecture today, um, make it this property right here. Display flex. Fixes so many of your problems. Has anyone played around with Flexbox yet? A little bit. Played around with grid? Wow. You skipped Flexbox and went to grid. I heard Rachel Andrews. Look that person up if you wanna if you want to really do a deep dive on how CSS works, like not just what properties have what effects, but like kind of the philosophy behind how CSS is designed. Rachel Andrews actually argues that learning grid makes Flexbox more intuitive. So I don't know if that's like, maybe that's crazy. I haven't thought about that enough yet, but yeah. So Flexbox, as we're jumping ahead a little bit, but Flexbox is like a one-dimensional layout plan. Grid is a two-dimensional layout plan. Um, but a lot of the same concepts apply, and in fact, as the CSS spec grows and develops, there's wording in there to take the things that Flexbox can do and just let you do them anywhere. So you can do things like space things evenly based on how much space there's in the container without needing to use Flexbox at all. You can just do that on a table cell or a block level element or anything. But before that makes sense, we should probably talk about Flexbox at all. So let's get into that. So there are a few key terms with Flexbox. Uh, I'll talk about the Flex container. So that's the parent element. If you've been using Bootstrap, that's like your div that has class row. That's like a row container, right? Um, so that parent element that has all the items that you want to arrange is what we'll call the Flex container or the Flex box. I'll sometimes say by accident. Um, the Flex item is something inside of a Flex container. So a Flex container contains many items. Um, Flex items don't need to know that they're Flex items. If you set the parent container to display Flex, everything inside of it, regardless of what its display plan is a Flex item now. So if it's a grid, it'll continue behaving like a grid. If it's a block level element or an inline element, it will just kind of like follow the Flexbox plan. That's for direct children. So the question was, does that apply only to direct children or to children of children? I guess descendants versus children. So it only applies to direct children. Um, you can tell the children to just inherit the display property of the parent, but usually you just do that when you need to. So we have a flex container, we have a flex item, we have a main axis. Remember how I said Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout plan? That means if things are lining up left to right, that's your main axis, left to right. The other axis is the cross axis, the one that crosses the main axis. So we do that for, you have an image that's this big and an image that's this big. How should they line up? Do they line up like top edge, bottom edge, center, or something different? Or do they just stretch? And when we talk about justifying, justify doesn't really, if you think like what justify and align mean in Microsoft Word, you'll probably get a little bit confused. Justify means how things are arranged along the main axis. So how things are arranged horizontally if it's a row and how they're arranged vertically if it's a column. And align means how they're arranged on the cross axis. It's that thing we were talking about with big image, little image, how they align this way. So there are lots of cool things you can do with Flexbox. It's very powerful, very expressive for programming in these fluid behaviors of web pages. But to get started with it, you only really need to know 4 CSS properties. The first one is display flex. You put that on the parent container. Done. That was easy. Second one is flex direction. You can, this property describes whether things line up this way or whether they line up this way. And that's about as easy as it sounds. Importantly, flex direction defaults to row. So if you just set a box to display flex, it'll default to displaying in a row. Justify content means, so assuming we have a flex box that's in a row, do things line up against the start of the flex box or the end of the flex box, or do they center in the middle, or do they spread out somehow? So you have all these properties that describe that, and we'll experiment with those in a little bit. So I'm kind of going through this kind of 10,000 feet, and then we'll try an example. And then align item is how they align the other way. Align items rather. So the question was, if you change from column to row, does your justify continue to apply to the new main axis? Or does it continue to apply? Does it flip the axis? Yes, it does. So the justify and align properties are pinned to the definition of the main axis and the cross axis. So if the main axis changes, the behavior of the align properties change and the justify properties change. You can actually, I didn't put it in here, but you can actually say justify content left. And then if it's column, I don't even know what it does. I think it just doesn't work. So by doing that, you could say, so I don't want it to align, I want it to align at the left if it's a row and at the bottom if it's a column. But yeah, for most of them, they're just pinned to the direction of the main axis. So here's a super simple example of how you might, put a bunch of items in a flex box. And then we'll jump into like a live example. So I have some markup where, a little bigger. I have some markup where I have a section tag and I have some text. 4 elements. That means I'm going to end up with 4 flex items. I set the section to display flex. I'm done. Display flex is going to, this parent is going to tell all of its children that, I don't know if you were a block or inline or whatever before, but now you line up horizontally. You take up as much space as you need, following your own rules, and then you line up in a row. So if you want 4 text nodes or 4 text elements in a row, that's all there is to it. We'll look at an example of how that actually plays out. So this is example 1 fluid layout. If you're following along at home, I'm actually going to open it on my local machine. No, not that. There we go. So in this case, we have like kind of some sophisticated behavior here. I'm actually going to hide this text underneath for a bit. Okay. So I have these boxes, and what's going on with them is the markup is very simple. So I'm just going to collapse that because that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at this, which looks a lot like the sample in the README, I think. Yes. How's that? Better? Is that okay with Victoria? I'll take your silence as a yes. Um, so it's class grow because I'm demonstrating the flex grow property. And because I stole this from a different lecture. So each of these divs, they have a min width and a min height. So that means all other things being equal, um, they'll be 80 pixels by 80 pixels unless they're told somehow to stretch, say by their flex container. The flex grow property decides how, when you're dividing up extra space, how it's going to be divided. So a normal div inside of the section with the class grow is going to have a flex grow of 1, and that's the Rebecca purple ones. They each have flex grow 1. The second child has, which is depicted in Dodger blue, has flex grow 6. We have one with flex grow 2 and one with flex grow 0. So what that means is instead of defining like your 1 column, your 3 columns, your 8 columns like you would in Bootstrap, we just describe like, okay, as space is being divided up, who gets more and by what proportion. So we can see that as the window grows, for every 1 pixel that the Rebecca purple boxes get, the blue box gets 6. And the green box, or sorry, the fire brick box gets 2. And the chartreuse box, its flex grow is set to 0, so it doesn't grow at all. It says, I don't want your pixels. So we can see that these Rebecca purple boxes are subtly getting bigger. The lion's share of this space is going to the Dodger blue box. And chartreuse could care less. But when we get very small, they're all the same size. They get pushed off the page, yeah. And so if I wanted to prevent that, I would probably make them wrap. But then wrap is like, it complicates how the growing and shrinking works. So you have to do, it takes kind of some fiddling to make them like wrap without, to grow first and then wrap. Yeah, when they get down to 80 pixels, they're just 80 pixels. They don't get any smaller than that. They're uniform. So that's an alternative to that kind of column-based layout, right? You can say this whole flex container will take up the entire width of the screen, and we'll distribute this space proportionally in this way. So the benefit of that versus doing the column thing is that if you have columns in like a bootstrap row or something, and you have like this thing gets 3 columns and this thing gets 3 columns and this thing gets 6, that's great. And then you add another item to that row. You go, okay, so how big is that going to be now? And you have to redo all your column math and figure out, all right, so Bootstrap uses 12 on purpose because it's easy to do math on 12. But you still have to go and change all your classes, right? With Flexbox, you don't have to do that. You can just drop another element in, tell it how much to flex grow or just don't, and it'll fit in, and all these proportions will adjust dynamically, so you don't have to hard code those in, which is nice. Going to display this now. So now we have some text. Where'd my background go? I thought I had blanched almond for my background. Oh well. So we have a bunch of text. I don't know if you've read it all yet. It's only been a few seconds, but the text here is all identical. What do you notice about how the space is being used? The column on the left is taking up far more space than the one on the ones on the right and left. No, the right, the center and right. I'm gonna say that again. The column on the left is taking up far more space than the center column or the right column. That's right. In fact, these two seem to be taking up the same amount of space, which I think is kind of an illusion of being zoomed in. If we go out, you can see it's a little different than that. So I'm going to zoom in to about there, I think. Yeah. So what's the behavior of text inside of an element? Yeah, it's going to push out as far as it can. It's just going to put one letter in front of the next as long as it can until for some reason it's compelled to, maybe there's like a velvet rope and it could go past it if it wants. But it goes, "Oh, a rope," and it wraps to the next line. Or maybe there's like a brick wall and it goes, "Oh, a wall," and it wraps to the next line. Something will tell the text element, "Okay, you need to wrap because you're out of space." So if these were all if these all had their way, they would just go out. It would just be one line of text that trails off the screen. But they don't. They wrap. So how does that wrapping behavior work? Watch what happens as the window scales. What do you notice? They're not going at the same time, right? So one of the things that you can program into your layout with Flexbox is the priority of conceding space. You can do that with the flex shrink property. So let's look at, let's make these dev tools a little bigger. 2, 3, and 1. So a normal paragraph in the style sheets I've laid out will have a flex shrink value of 1. And that's this paragraph, has 1. Second paragraph has a flex shrink of 3. So if I uncheck that, we see it's much greedier about the space that it takes. Um, yes, so the higher the number is, the more willing that element is to concede space. Um, the higher the number, the more willing it is to concede space. So if I uncheck this min width property, we'll see that this one element will just keep shrinking and shrinking. Zoom back out again so we can really see this. So much of responsive design is just grabbing the edge of a window and just doing this. When people are inspecting your final projects, they'll be like, this is like kicking the tires. I just want to see if it breaks. Um, so now it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and it gets very narrow indeed. And then it stops, and the second one starts to go. So before I had min width set to 10em, what's going on now? How does it decide when to stop wrapping now? The longest word, yeah, exactly. So it'll keep wrapping, and we can configure what causes text to wrap. We can make it wrap on a letter. We can make it wrap on a hyphen. Um, but by default, it's the longest word. So once you can't subdivide a word further, um, it'll say that's the smallest I can go. Deal with it. Overflow if you have to. So we keep going, and that one gets very squished. And that's pretty unreadable. So if this was like an actual layout that I plan to, make people look at, I might set minimum width so I know that it won't get narrower than that. And maybe we find that to be too narrow as well, so we can set that to, I don't know, see what 20em looks like. Yeah. This is on the flex item, yeah. Yeah. So the flex item doesn't need to know that it's a flex box. But there are certain attributes that you can give to an item that affect how it behaves inside of a flex box. Um, yeah, so if you set flex shrink on something that was not inside of a flex box, the rule would just be ignored. which is probably what you want because you might have some other CSS that's going to toggle on and off whether the parent is a flex item. In which case, when it's on, you want it to behave in that way, and when it's off, you want it to just ignore it. So that's good. Um, yeah. So any questions so far about fluid design, Flexbox? Yes. So the question was, what if you have a super long word, um, and it doesn't it doesn't break. It doesn't have any obvious breakpoints, like it doesn't have any white space to break on or something else. How does it break? Um, it kind of won't by default. So I think this is breaking because we have these special characters in there, and I don't know exactly what that does, but I think that causes it to break. So I'm gonna try just mash. Yeah. Yeah, so super long words have or I mean, I don't think there's a word that long. Um, um, so yeah, so the observation is that this can be an issue that you have with Tweeter, for example, if you're just banging in some input text and you just mash your keyboard with your fingers and not your thumbs, so you don't get any spaces, and you just get this big long string. It just overflows when you submit the tweet. Is it when you submit the tweet, it overflows the container. And I think your solution was to just hide the overflow, right? Right. So if the largest word is very, very, very long, then if you're just splitting on words, what do you do? Um, so yeah, so the proposed solution for when your text overflows a container is to just hide the overflow. But let's talk about a few different things that you could do for that. Um, so I think what you asked was, does Flexbox have a feature to handle that? Flexbox doesn't, because Flexbox doesn't care about text. Flexbox cares about boxes. So when it sees this, it just sees a box that's asking for this much space, and it decides what to do with it. Flexbox doesn't have any features that deal with text at all. I don't know if that's strictly true. Feels true. Um, so what can you do about this? One option is, as you said, we can grab grab the element, just set overflow hidden. That'll solve it. Oh, but what if I want my user to be able to get to it? I can set the overflow to scroll, and now I can get at all of that. But that's not really a great user experience, probably, right? Because how is the user to know that there's more there? There's an what's it called? There's a property where you can affect where if there's overflow, what element displays here to indicate that there's overflow with dots. Yeah, with I think it's a text overflow. Let's see if I can make that work. I can never make this work, so this is probably gonna fail. Uh, text overflow. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. So yeah, my overflow has, when it's still overflowing, I have this ellipsis to indicate that there's overflow. Still not a great solution. I think to answer your question about like, can we make it break on something else? Yes, we can. I forget how that works. I think maybe it's word wrap. Maybe it's word break. Break all. Yeah, there we go. It does do the thing, right? Yes. So this isn't this was not the word wrap property. It was the word break property. Yeah. And I think I set it to break all. Would you like to see it again? Okay. Yeah. So now that we're breaking on words, we don't need the overflow and we don't need the ellipsis any longer. We can see that even breaking in this way, we still get that same behavior where as far as distributing space, Flexbox is still going to leave this element alone for as long as it can before it starts chewing away at its space. Well, that's kind of crazy. Cool. Um, any other questions about this stuff yet? This Flexbox stuff? Okay. Cool. Let's keep going and talk about the Holy Grail. Who has heard of the Holy Grail? Um, so I don't know if real is the right word, but the traditional mythical Holy Grail um, was this symbol of something much desired but very unattainable. And so the analogy for layout is back in the day, this layout here. You have header at the top of the page, beneath which is a bunch of content. So you have two sidebars. Maybe one has ads, one has nav links, or one has articles that we think you should read. And then in the center, there's some main content, the thing that you came for and are interested in reading, the news story or whatever. And then beneath that is a footer. So back in the day, pre-Flexbox, you would go out in like your wolfskin tunic with like a basket of like margins and floats and things, and you just try to cobble this together yourself. And you'd get something that looked kind of like that, and then someone would say, well, our ads are 200 pixels, and your whole thing would fall apart, and everybody would laugh at you, and you'd be run out of town. Um, so getting a layout like this was thought to be just it's like such an obvious thing to want. Like designers are like, this is ideal. This is just like a standard way for a web page to look. But there was no plan for doing it, or the plan for doing it was just very kind of hacky. And if you look at the markup, it's just you have like divs and spans, and they break and clear, and you have elements that only exist to push some other elements out of the way, and some elements that only exist to like space things out. So you have like spacer and gap elements, and just like an ocean of classes that all have complex inheritance hierarchies and margins set to auto, and it was a big mess. You almost couldn't do it. It was almost foolish to pursue. like the mythical Holy Grail. Um, with Flexbox, it's super easy. Your markup looks like this. Your CSS looks like this. And there's like a little more to it than that. If you just do this, if this is all your pages, you just won't see anything on the page. Because there's no content, right? So in this example, the reason these boxes behave the way they do, and the reason I chose a block of text here, is because text has this natural proclivity to push things out in it. Like it has a certain behavior to it. It pushes out as far as it can until something tells it to not anymore, please, and then it wraps, right? So that's why when we're demonstrating flex shrink, could have done it with images, but text is a good use case for something that wants to take up a lot of space but is amicable to wrapping if it has to. Um, so you would have to fill this with content, and you might end up doing something with like some min widths, max widths, to kind of tell it to take up space. But basically, this is it. So what do we have here? We set the whole body to display flex. We set the flex direction to column. Okay, and the way to think of that is that this whole thing is a flex box. This is a flex element. This whole thing is a flex element. This is our main element. Um, and this is a flex element. So from Flexbox's perspective, you have box 1, box 2, box 3. Inside of box 2, there are more elements. So box 2 is called main here. So main is also display flex. Flexbox defaults to row alignment. So we get these things aligned in a row, aside, article aside. And we're kind of done. So do I have an example of that? I do, thank you. Thank you for asking. I do have an example of a Holy Grail. I think there's a link to an example on the thing. Yeah. So this is what my Holy Grail layout looks like that I made in like 30 seconds and didn't care enough to fix the margins over here. Um, but that's easy to fix, right? I actually only have margins so that you can see the spacing between the boxes. Um, my way to fix the margins would probably be to not, to just remove the margins altogether. Um, but yeah, so what's going on here is I have all of my elements set to be background color Dodger blue, as one does. And there's some behavior baked into this design. Most notably, there's no content on this page, it's just these elements. So I had to hard code in some expectations about how big things are going to be using min widths and max widths. So notice that as we scale, what happens? So the header and footer just get bigger and smaller. Okay, good. And how do these columns behave? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the columns have some behavior baked in where I noticed that there's a certain proportion that I want here between the two. But I'm willing to violate that proportion once this column has reached a certain narrowness. I don't want them to keep getting narrow forever. And in fact, I did such a good job at defending the remaining space in these columns that the center article will just disappear altogether. Um, so yeah, do you want to, are we interested in digging into the CSS for this at all? Or shall we move on to the next thing? Pardon me? Oh, could we do it with a fixed header? Good question. If you wanted a fixed header, you'd probably not include it in like the main flex box. because the flexbox is fitting things into the flow of the body, and when you set something to fixed, you're taking it out of that flow, and you're just deciding here it is on the page. Does that make sense? You're pinning the header to the viewport rather than to the flow of the document. Oh yeah, yeah. So if you set the header to fixed, um, then it just crosses out. It crosses out the property. It just ignores the property. Right. The yellow triangle of shame. Um, yeah. So if you want it to be fixed, forget about trying to put it into a flex box. Just put it at the top of the page outside of the thing that you have set to display flex, and just handle it on its own because it's an absolutely positioned element now relative to the viewport. Or it's absolutely relative to the viewport. Nice. So it's relative to the viewport and not positioned as part of the document flow anymore. So it's outside of Flexbox's purview if you want to do that. Yep. So the question was, if you do that, will these other elements work? And yes, they will, because just instead of um, 3 flex boxes sharing this space, you have 2 flex boxes sharing this space. And you can, when you have your flex boxes set up properly, you can just add and remove flex items to them, and it kind of just works. Question. That was not a question, but yes. But okay, it right. um, so the okay. The question was so if you did have the navbar set to fixed, then inside of the navbar you could treat the items there as flex items. So you could set the navbar to display flex, even though it's fixed, and everything inside of it would behave like a flex box, even though the parent element was pinned to the top of the viewport. Right? And the answer is right. Follow-up question. Properties. Yeah. So there's no way to give an element both display flex and display fixed. So what up? Yeah, so you would nest, as you said, you would just nest the thing with display flex inside a thing with display fixed. And you just make sure the display flex thing is like full width and full height, so it just completely covers up the fixed element. Yeah, good point. Cool. I think now's a good time for a break, and we'll come back in like 5 or 10 minutes and learn some more about other responsive techniques. Split screen. Cool. Victoria, y'all with me? Okay, so I thought in the off chance that you find yourselves building anything with like something that looks like a card, or you have like a header with some important header information in it, then some body text and a footer. If that comes up, I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about how you might make those with something like Flexbox, and how you might make them responsive once the layout hits kind of the limit. So I prepared some of these. Um, and this is just Flexbox. I thought it might be cool if I broke this up into two different style sheets. So one was just like the like what color things should be and stuff like that, and the other was like the actual layout stuff. I thought maybe it'd be interesting to like do that and then style them, but you'd like never really develop that way, so we're not really gonna do that. So what's going on here? Knowing that these are flex boxes, how would you break this down? How would you approach designing the flex box model around these cards? Yes. You'd have the main column. Yeah, so you'd have some parent element, top level element, that is set to flex direction column and display flex. Yes, good start. Does anyone else want to jump in? You paused like you were done, but yeah, to get that. Yeah. Um, good start. Good start. And that might be enough. But it turns out this header is also a flex box. So I want to dig into that a little bit. Um, oops. What am I doing? There we go. So these sections I'm going to make them just a little wider. You notice what happens when they get wider to the content inside of the box? And maybe we won't fix the width at all. And we'll see how they grow and shrink. Whoa, what happened there? That was for later, but um, so this one's got a little more text. We probably don't want this because we want all our cards to be kind of uniform. But watch what happens to this header when it grows and shrinks. Should really get rid of that breakpoint. What's going on there? How would you describe the behavior that I've built into this? Oh yeah, so talking about importance, like where things are in the information hierarchy. That's definitely how I decided to do my breakpoints, and it's just kind of an unfortunate accident that those keep hitting. So I'm just gonna comment all this out for now. Spoilers for later. Um, so I think yeah, knowing that grows and shrinks, turn off the hard-coded width. So now as it grows and shrinks, how is this space used by the header? Yeah, I'd hesitate to think of it as the margins, because margin is an attribute you set, right? And as an aside, one of the great things about Flexbox is that instead of using your margin attribute um, to set your layout, you can use your margin attribute for setting your margins. Does that make sense? So when you're aligning things, thinking about it, chewing on it. So when you're using your margins to say like this thing should be all the way over here and this thing should be centered, margin left auto, margin right auto, that kind of thing, um, then you've compromised your ability to actually set a margin when you want, okay, now two things are like next to each other, but I don't want them to like butt up against each other. I want them to space out by like 5 pixels or something. Um, so when you use margin for layout, you lose the ability to do that. Um, so when you get like to this size, this image and this text, they won't have any. They won't know how close to get to one another because you're using your margins for something other than just like how far apart things should stay. Um, so with Flexbox, you can describe how you want things to be distributed in the container. It's like how this extra space is used, right? So what's going on here is what are the two properties I use to change how things are distributed in a container? One along the main axis, one along the cross axis. Justify content and align items. So which one controls where these things go? How they're distributed. This property is controlled by justify content. Yeah, you're supposed to be looking at this. So good, good. You're totally supposed to cheat at this. Yeah, justify content space between, right? So that's on the header. Can make that a little bigger. So justify content space between. If I uncheck this, the header's going to go to whatever it defaults to. Yeah, left or in terms of the main axis cross axis. Flex start. So when I take that away, they just all jam up against the left, separated by the margin. But they're all like scooting to the left as far left as they can go towards the flex start. Um, so I can I can put them all the way to the flex end if I want them to align there. So for your tweeter footer, for example, down here, you want all those icons over there. How do I get the icons over there? It's pretty easy with Flexbox. Flex container, I just want them at the end of there. Yeah. And then when you want more icons down there, you don't have to do anything special to them. You just throw them into the Flexbox, and the Flexbox decides how to distribute them. Very nice. So what else can we do? How else can we justify content here? We have all sorts of flexibility in how in how we distribute these here. It's kind of up to us to decide what we want. So space between pushes everything out as far as it can go, right? So when I want the leftmost element in the left corner and the rightmost element in the right corner, space between, I can also center them. Now as the window grows and shrinks, they stay pretty much the same distance apart, centered in the container. Sometimes that's the thing you want. And of course, there's how much space is between them now is decided by the margin, right? So each flex item is responsible for deciding how much space gets around it. And the flex box is like, well, get as close as you're comfortable with. Yeah. I'll figure out how to use the extra space. You just make sure you defend your personal bubble. I'll figure it out. So we also have a bunch of different like space them out attributes. So in addition to space between, we have space around. What's that look like it does? I'm using the space around property on justify content. Yeah. So it works much like space between, but instead of sometimes you just want things like lined up, like maybe it's like 3 product images or something, and you don't want one like pushed all the way to the left and one all the way to the right. You just want them kind of spaced out normally. I have a thing that's like 400 pixels wide, and I have some images that are like, I don't know, 100 pixels or something, and I just want them spaced out. So how space between works is it takes the available amount of space, and it puts equal amounts of space between each flex item, and whatever amount it puts there, it puts half of that on the edges. Right? So you notice that if we measure this out with my ruler tool, which is like super tiny and I can barely read it, so sorry about that. That's about 163 pixels, so we would expect this to be like roughly half of that. That's 80 pixels, so that's pretty close. I probably should have measured it first and then explained it in case I was wrong. So yeah, if you want like, no, it's important that it's equal amounts of space. Space evenly. And now that space is like, it's a subtle difference. I'm actually not even sure that worked. Yeah. So space evenly is I need as much elbow room between me and the edge of the container as I do between me and the next element. So in this case, we definitely want space between. So that's cool. And then that's yeah, that's nice and flexible. That's about all that's interesting about like the flex properties. It's like there's not that much there. There's not that much to it. You can throw this together pretty quickly once you kind of know the basic mechanics of Flexbox. So when we get quite small, you know, it gets squished and doesn't look good. Eventually, this layout breaks down. So anytime you have a cool layout that you think like this looks good and everything works the way I want it to, the next thing you have to think about is like, what are the tolerances of that layout? How much text can I put in one of those boxes before it's a problem? How big can the images be before they're a problem? Like, do I handle arbitrary image sizes? Do I handle arbitrary image ratios, right? If the image is very it's like a panoramic image, does my Flex container handle it properly? And of course, viewport sizes. If I'm on a mobile device, does it look bad? And once you know your tolerances, you can. I'm gonna just refresh the page, by the way, get it back to normal. Once you know your tolerances, you can start to think about, well, what am I gonna do when things exceed those tolerances? Am I gonna overflow? Am I gonna force really long words to wrap? Things like that. But also, when am I gonna switch to a new layout strategy? When is that flex row gonna become a flex column, for instance? A lot of times, if you have if you have some images lined up one next to the other, and the screen gets narrow and the images become like kind of spaghetti looking, the right thing to do is just make them wrap, or make the whole container reorient. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how do we make it look good on smaller screen sizes? How do we switch to a different strategy? And the answer is that stuff I commented out. So I'm in O3 cards layout in the repo. And we're going to look at media queries next. So can everybody see that? Is that okay for you in the back? Okay. So this is what a media query looks like. And what you're doing with a media query is you're saying, well, you're making a query, which means you're asking a question. Who are you asking it to? The window, yeah. The browser. You're asking the browser. So you're asking the browser for information about like what kind of device you're on. So the browser has all this metadata about like, is this considered a mobile device? Is this considered a tablet or a desktop? Is this considered a large screen? Is this considered a piece of paper if you're trying to print the thing out? Sorry, I cut you off there. Yeah, so these rules will apply up to 45 Ms. Why did I choose 45 Ms? Because it's a relative unit. Relative to what? Yeah. Yeah. So an M is the measurement of I think the capital letter M in your selected typeface at your selected size in the context of it's not necessarily like the direct parent, but it's like something that might have been inherited like from the body or something. Um, but yeah, like it goes kind of up the inheritance hierarchy until it finds something setting a font family and a font size. And then it says, well, how many pixels wide is the capital M, I think. I feel like that might be a myth. Um, how wide is one character, like the widest character? And that's what an M is. And we choose that um, kind of by noticing at what width these lines start to break down, where it's just like not that nice to read. If you wanted all of your um, tweeter tweets to wrap or to switch to a different layout when they reach 140 characters, um, we might want a monospaced font. Uh, but you might want to set it to something like 140M, wrap it 140M. Or maybe 130M because not every message is going to be a string of capital M's. Is it? It is capital M? Thank you. Good to know. Um, so yeah, most media queries that we care about just look like this. It's not much more complicated than this. It's just uh, this is an at attribute, at attribute media, some qualifier, usually max width, min width. Usually all we care about is the width. Um, and then some measurement. If you find that this just works better for pixel values, you can do that too. So back in the day, the way you do your media queries is when they were first developed, it was so your website would look good on the iPhone specifically. So they just make a media query for like when the size of the window is exactly the size of an iPhone, then do this. So you wouldn't even have like a range. You just do like width and then like whatever an iPhone is. Um, but we don't do that anymore because there's more than one phone that a website might be viewed on. There are more than you want to write special layouts for. So doing device width is kind of a terrible idea. A better plan for deciding where your breakpoints should be is just, well, when does my layout start to break down? When am I outside the tolerances of my layout? So what happens inside of this media query? First I set the background to Burleywood instead of blanched almond. That's just like a nice contrast. Um, the section is going to change to flex direction row. So as you explained earlier, currently it's column, right? Header, body, footer. I decided, okay, we're not going to do that. We're just going to have like kind of like a horizontal thing now. The content is going to stretch. So before it was doing the default thing, and what's the default thing? What does justify content do by default? It goes to flex start, right? Um, I'm really harping on this because like understanding why your layout is doing what it's doing, and understanding like, oh, why is this all stretched out? Um, having a good understanding of what the defaults are for your styles helps so much with that. When you notice that like, oh, this is all stretched out, what's up with that? Oh, I know, because a line item's defaults to stretch. Okay, so I need to set that. That's how you solve those problems. You consider like, all right, well, what's the default behavior then? And if you don't memorize it, that's okay. You can look it up. But it should occur to you, this is happening because of some default property that I can override. So we set justify content to stretch. Previously, it was default. Um, and we make it wide. What is that thing? Does anyone know what 90 VW means? It's viewport width. Yeah. It's a dynamic unit. Yeah. It's a relative unit. Yep. Um, so is this though. Why didn't I do that? No, no, change it to a percent. Yeah, so the percentages actually have a bunch of different behaviors, right? Depending on the context. So in this case, the relevant one is the thing you said. That the percentage is going to look at the parent element and then make it 90% of that. And that's not really what I want, especially because like I don't know and I don't want to keep track of what size the parent is, right? So if I haven't set any width on the parent is kind of looking at the children to decide how wide it should be, and then the children are looking to the parent to decide how wide it should be, and then you just end up having dinner at 10 o'clock because nobody can decide on a restaurant. So if we just pin it to the view width from the get-go here, then the section will say, I have a rather strong opinion about how wide I should be. And if you don't have any objections, I'm just going to be that wide. You pin it to a definite fixed value. Not fixed in the sense that it can't change, because as the window grows and shrinks, it does change. But fixed in the sense that it's not like looking to some other element to see how big it should be, and maybe I'll adjust if you add another thing in. It's fairly consistent. Yeah. So yeah, good point. So view width units, and we also have view height units, which is probably a bad idea. I kind of want to see what that looks like. Yeah, it's terrible. We also have view height units. These are based on 100. This is just like a thing to know. It's like a percentage. 100 means full height or full width. Let's get rid of that. That looks better. So I also do. You pointed out that I made some decisions about my information hierarchy, where I decided that the profile picture is the important identifier for each card. It's the top level piece of information in the header. So the other information I completely hide, and I do that with. I have these selectors which are kind of crunchy. I have a section inside of which is a header, inside of which is an H1, and same thing with an H2. Doesn't it feel like we should clean that up somehow? It's called foreshadowing. Um, so that H1 and H2 I'm going to set to display none. So only when this media query fires do we set to display none. And then for main, I get rid of a border. Like I don't know if y'all noticed, but I worked really hard on these borders up here and down here. Those go away. And I set flex grow. And the reason I do that is because if I don't, I think it does something weird. No, I fixed that. Okay. So I can actually get rid of that. I think. Okay, yeah, that actually looks fine now. I'm a big believer that when you discover that you don't need a CSS property, just get rid of it. I love deleting code. Especially CSS, because like your CSS gets kind of it kind of bloats anyway, and it's hard to keep organized. So if you find you don't need some, just get rid of it. Uh, yep. Okay, so the question was I'm using this greater than symbol to say section takes precedent over main. That's not what this means in this context. This means if I just do this, then I'm saying any main that has an ancestor that's a section, right? So I can have section div paragraph main, and this style will apply to it. Um, if I use the right chevron, it says only if you're a direct descendant of a section and also a main should this apply to you. So that's just to make sure that if I do some complex nesting later on, that like this particular hierarchy where it's a section that contains a main and not a section that contains some other stuff that contains a main, that this rule applies. Um, so yeah, good question. And then for the footer, I just display none because it just had a turtle. I didn't really put anything in there, and it wasn't a very important turtle. Um, so yeah. So for those things that I hid, you might actually want to write something more elaborate that like maybe when you hover over this, it like expands and shows you more information about it or something. Um, but yeah, and otherwise it's all the same styles. I have same min height, same font size. Sometimes one of the things you want to change is the font size. Um, you find it looks fine on desktop, but it's too small or too big on mobile. So that's a thing that's popular to change. And of course, all this layout stuff. So I like making layouts where when you use Flexbox, you have this like nice, flat, pretty readable, pretty semantic layout. Um, and when it's semantic in this way, and you don't have too many elements, where the only purpose of this element is just to like push things around or do layout. You don't have too much of that. Um, it's quite easy to just restyle these however you want. So you can look at examples of different designs being made for the same markup where it's like a totally different page, totally different information hierarchy, totally different presentation, um, same markup. So that's a nice thing to maintain. So let's truck right along to, if you want to know more about like other stuff you can do with media queries, I have it in my lecture notes. Um, there's a bunch of stuff you can do like other than you used to be able to, you can't do it anymore now, it's deprecated, but you used to be able to have like a special layout for Braille. I have no idea what that was for. Um, but they had all these, if it's like a teletype or a TV or a projector, Braille. Um, yeah, you could have like all these different layouts and things, and it was kind of crazy. Oh, interesting. So they take the text as input and then like raise pins on like some mechanical device, so you can read what a web page says in Braille. That's so cool. That's super cool. I don't know how that would affect how I write my CSS. I'm sure it would, but yeah, it's like you don't want to use a font that's too complicated because they'll be like, what the hell's that? No, that doesn't make sense. That was a silly idea. One thing I'll flag is for your media queries to work, you need this dumb thing. I feel like web development right now is like at a point where we don't have too much. I don't know, man. Here's just some magic words you need to make the thing work. But this is one of them. You need a meta tag named viewport, and you have to say that the content you can pass a bunch of attributes to it, and the width is the device width. You just have to do that so that the browser knows to report to the page, like to the DOM, I think, what the viewport width is, what the device width is, so you can then report it down to the CSS. So if your media queries aren't working, make sure you have your meta tag in here, and you can just Google like why aren't my media queries working, and everybody will tell you just add this meta tag. So that's a bit of a gotcha. Before I let y'all go, we're going to talk real quick about Sass. Does anyone know what Sass is? Yeah, it's a CSS preprocessor. Yeah, so what's that mean? What do we get out of a preprocessor? Pardon? It's a program running in the browser. Not quite. So Sass doesn't actually run in the browser. It runs on uh, it's either a command line tool or it's like a tool that like the server uses. It's something that runs server side. So when we're just developing like dumb static web pages, I just have a command line tool where I say, okay, I have this SCSS file. I pass it to the command line tool, and the command line tool spits out some regular style sheets. So let's have a little look at that. I'm now moving to 04 Sass. And this file is not that interesting. It's the same as it's the same content as this, but I just refactored it. So as we were talking about before, some of this stuff looks like pretty pretty verbose, pretty long. Like I know I want this hierarchy between section header h1 and section header h2. But then I have to write them both out, and it's just like a lot to read and like an extra layer of cognitive overhead. They have all these things where, all these properties where I'm going section header class, section header image, and I just kind of have these paths to the different things that I'm creating. And that's pretty annoying. It would be like if you had to, like if you had an object that was like, right, and I had a JSON object like this, but I couldn't just write this. I had to write like and I had to do that for like every path. And then if I got deeply nested, it'd be like people. Actually, this would be people.0. People. Oh, what's a name for a dog? Rex. Okay. And then all of like everything I just had to like lay out like this, and I couldn't just write things nested like that. That'd be really tedious. And in CSS, it often is. So I refactored that to make it a little bit easier to work with. So let's look at what Sass looks like. Sass looks a lot like CSS, doesn't it? But what I'm taking advantage of here is with Sass, you can use nesting. I'm just going to talk about a few cool things Sass does. It does all sorts of cool things. We're just going to touch on the things I think are most useful, that really make it worth using. So I have my my section element, and then I have this media query nested inside the section. So all I need to do to know how a section behaves when I do a media query is look right here. Compare that to the other file, the CSS file, where I have all of my non-media query namespace styles out here. So I have a section rule out here. I have to go down here and look for a section rule down here to find that. Here I just nest the media query inside of the section rule. I also have a bunch of rules that pertain to headers, right? And in my, why do I keep closing this? Here I have to go section chevron header, section chevron header all. That selects all the elements that are direct descendants of headers, by the way. So here I go section, and nested inside of the section is a header, and nested inside of that is an all selector. Cool. Yeah, so I can do all this like complex nesting, and this is the exact same CSS. Is it shorter? Yeah, the file extension is going to be SCSS, and the preprocessor is called SAS. Yeah. SAS converts it to regular CSS so the browser can still go. That's right. So I have this. Use that on the screen. This SCSS file, and then I have a similarly named style.css. And the style.css.map, which is something that the SAS preprocessor generates. And I don't actually know what that does. Yeah, SAS does that. We don't touch that, and furthermore, we don't do anything with the style sheet other than just like look at it and pass it to a web page, right? So this is kind of, it looks a little messy, um, but that's okay because it's like compiled code. We don't deal with this file. This file is generated. So on the command line, the way that it's generated, is just we use, I'm using the RubyGem version of SAS, apparently. Let's change to. So I'm going to do something absolutely insane. I'm going to delete these files that I have. So now if we look at gonna throw that page up and like, whoa, what a mess. It's almost like there's no styling at all. Um, so yeah, right now there's just this SCSS file in here, and if we look at the index.html, I'm still importing a regular CSS file. Importing style.scss will not work. The browser has no idea what that is. So I'm going to need to compile it. So I'm going to go sas -- watch, and I pass it an input file. SAS is watching for changes. Press Control C to stop. So this sounds a lot like what an Express server does, right? So it's just listening, and then when the thing it's listening for happens, it does some stuff, just like a Express server. So the first thing it does is it tells me what it's been doing. It writes style.css and it writes style.css.map. So it notices that they're not there, and it brings it back. So that's cool. Exactly. So what SAS Watch does is when you change this to, like, I don't know, golden rod, golden row, golden rod, change detected, and it writes new versions of those files. So yeah, you never want to modify those generated files. In general, you don't want to modify generated files. That's not always true, but you want to modify source files, not compiled files. So we only modify the style.scss, and then we just put the style CSS in the right place for the HTML page to grab it. Question? Is still nested? Yeah, I noticed that. Maybe you can just nest media queries. Um, yes, I noticed that. Maybe it's not actually. So yeah, I noticed with these media queries, I think it's deceptive because like if you look here, yeah, this section thing is not nested inside of, right? So yeah, yeah. So it's like this is what was generated, and it's actually not nested. So I saw that too, and I was like, oh, maybe it does do that. I hope nobody notices. Um, But no, it looks like these do not nest that way. Um, they're like broken out the way they were before. But what ends up happening is you just have the output just has, instead of having one of these media queries and like all the stuff inside, it just does those in line like this. And I don't know what its plan for indentation is. I don't really care because like we never really look at this file anyway. Um, but yeah, interesting point. A lot of the stuff that preprocessors do, uh, CSS just does on its own now. So it used to be that the main value proposition for SCSS was you can use variables. We have variables now. Um, but now CSS just has variables. You can ask me about them later or just look them up yourself, but you can just use variables in regular CSS now. That's what I did up here. This is not Sass, this is regular CSS. In Sass, variables look like $sign. I think you still do them in the root. So you just declare a variable like this, and then elsewhere you can use it like that. Uh, and my syntax highlighting is weird because CSS super doesn't do that. And we'll be very confused. Pardon me? Can you use flow control? What sort of flow control might you use? What might you use that for? What might you use that for? Mm. You can use variables. There are a bunch of functions you can use. Um, I can't think of. I don't know if flow control is really a thing, but if you can think of an example of like some flow control that you would want in your style sheets, let me know, and I bet there's like some way to do it that doesn't look like if else, but there's probably some way to approach flow control for whatever it is you're thinking about. Um, yeah, so that's nesting. Wow, we're really running out of time. Like I think we're 17 minutes over. So we're gonna jump ahead to so just looking at this file again. This is like still quite a lot, right? Like if you're trying to understand what's going on this page, nesting it this way is nice, especially because we can do this. That's text folding. When I'm trying to get the hang of a new file and it has a lot of stuff going on, what I like to do is fold all the text and then just see like, okay, what am I interested in? And if the code is written in, a reasonable hierarchical way, uh, then that'll be like fairly straightforward. So I know that, body is like, okay, that just has a little bit going on. It looks like I have these short rules that just configure some stuff out up front. And I have this section thing where most of the meat of the design is. So I have some rules for the section. It does something with a media query. Okay, I don't care about that for now. And then I see that it's broken down to header, main, footer. So how does main work? So I can interrogate, because it's nested now, I can interrogate things about the hierarchy of the styling instead of normal CSS, which is just flat and difficult to follow. And it doesn't have a natural system for organizing. So you're kind of at the mercy of whatever idea the person who wrote it had, which might be a good idea, might be a bad idea. Either way, it's like a lot. When everything's just like laid out flat, it's a lot. Um, so we can make this even cleaner by taking advantage of partials and imports. So you know how partials and imports work in EJS files? A little bit of experience with that. It's like you notice you have some bit of content that you can draw a box around and say like this is a card or this is my nav bar or something like that. And then you can just drop it in wherever you want it. Sass lets you do a similar thing. So I'm really sorry that I can't make this sidebar bigger, but I'm looking at 05 Sass imports now, if you're following along on your own machine. in the styles folder, and I have underscore footer.scss, underscore header, underscore main, underscore section. Kind of follows the same pattern as your EJS partials. Now let's look at the style CSS. So I have my, let's do the text folding thing again. So I have my body main section, like those same just flat rules as before. Then I have import section. So I got rid of all that stuff for section, and I put it away into this section CSS. Section CSS is just a bunch of rules that apply to section. And then the rules that I want for headers that are inside of sections, and main elements that are inside of sections, and footers that are inside of sections, I put each in their respective partials. And so this way, when I care about what's going on inside of main, I can just look at that code. And same thing for header, same thing for footer. And you can break this up as much or as little as you want, but that opens up a new way to keep track of and organize and develop hierarchies between and develop systems around how you write your CSS that more closely match how we write our server code. What's up? They don't have to be in the same directory. In this case, coincidentally, they are. But they don't have to be. So you would just have, I'm repeating for the stream. Yeah, you would just have, this is just basically a relative path. So if I had, if I had that inside of a components folder, then I would go, header. You'll also notice that the underscore is omitted here, which I think is how EJS works too. Is it not? You put the underscore in EJS? Okay. Maybe I'm wrong about that. If I'm wrong, then disregard that. Um, so yeah, and what's cool about this is if I want this header behavior in some other part of the app, I can just import it over there too. So I have this way that headers always behave the same way wherever I put them. And you can like write your rules so that they handle that. But again, like when you write rules, they're just flat rules, right? They don't have like that hierarchy. So maybe what you want to do is explicitly call out, sections have headers, and if other things have headers too, those headers behave exactly the same way. And you can just do these imports all over the place. All over the place is probably the wrong way to put that. You can do these imports in appropriate, well-considered places. So yeah, is there anything else I want to talk about Sass? Yeah, I think that's all the time we have. If you go to the Sass website, first of all, it gives you instructions on how to install it, which is useful. It also tells you the various things it can do. Ooh, how responsive. So pre-processing variables, as we talked about, nesting and partials and imports, as we talked about. Mix-ins and inheritance are like object-oriented principles. So you can treat your CSS rules like object-oriented classes, which is cool. And operators give you a lot of power to do stuff like math. And if you're trying to get flow control out of your styles, the operators that you can use are a good place to look to for that. A lot of these operators have been kind of displaced by CSS now has the calc function. So you can do things like, I think in my Holy Grail, I have rules that are like width is, I want to calculate 100% of the view width, but I know I have 10 pixels of margin on each side, so 100% of the view width minus 20 pixels. So I can mix units like this with just the CSS calc, and that's cool. And that's not a pitch for SCSS. That's just a cool thing that regular CSS can do. So yeah, give this a browse. I think maybe that's something that you're working on today is SaaS stuff. Stretch thing. Yeah. Oh, good. Cool. Cool. Um, so that's about it. I'm here all day. Any questions before we wrap it up? Okay, then that's it.